Biography tends to be more realistic and rational, while hagiography is exaggerated, and they will write things very dramatically. So for example, we know that the Afghan and the Turkish king came to India for material reasons. They came to raid the wealth of India. But in the hagiographies, they will keep telling how these kings came to India to spread Islam. It was a religious motivation. These were holy Ghazis fighting for the cause. So this is the PR department at work.
Studying literature across time and space provide us better insights about our culture. In this light, let us understand today's Sangam literature, Jain and Buddhist texts, and Persian literature in our today's episode of Art and Culture with Devdutt Pattanaik. Hello everyone, I am Manas Srivastava and you are watching UPSC Essentials of the Indian Express, where we are in conversation with Devdutt Pattanaik, who talks on art and culture and talks on those relevant topics which are very important for your examination and life in general. So in the last episode, we've talked about literature. We have covered, the time up to Gupta period. Today, let's shift our focus to other areas. Let's talk about South India, the Sangam literature. And Devdutt, I would like to start with a question, the past year UPSC question, which was on Sangam literature, and it goes like this. Though not very useful from the point of view of a connected political history of South India, the Sangam literature portrays the social and economic condition of its time with remarkable vividness. So, I think this question covers a lot of issues related to Sangam literature, which students should know. So, Devdutt, if you can enlighten our students with answer on this question.
So Sangam literature is Tamil poetry, old Tamil poetry that was written about 2000 years ago, and it goes from till about 1000 years ago. So from around 100 CE, some people say even 200 BCE, we are not very sure, but roughly 2000 years ago to up to 1000 years ago. So for a 1000-year period, we have this poetry written in old Tamil, which speaks of local conditions that existed in Tamil Nadu about 1500 years ago. So that's a rough way to remember it. And we find three phases of this poetry. We find the early phase where there is no reference to any particular religion. There are gods and there's landscapes, but there is no strong religious connotation that you find. And these are poems of love and war. The internal feminine poetry of love, known as Akam poetries, and the external violent poetry of heroes in battle, called Puram poetries, for the first 300 years. The next 300 years, you have got Buddhist and Jain stories manifesting as epics. Again, women play a very central role in this. And the following 300 years, you see the rise, the shift from Buddhism and Jainism towards what we call Hinduism, and the rise of the devotion towards Shiva and Vishnu, so the Namnars and the Alvars. This is all happening before the rise of the great Chola Empire, maybe even roughly ending at the time when the Pallavas take over. Now, why are we saying that it is not of much political significance? Because they really do not refer to any great empires. They're referring to chieftains, small people who live in small territories. Remember, when we talk about Ashoka referring to the South India, he speaks of Cheras, Pandyas and Cholas who exist beyond the Tungabhadra, nothing else. We know that there is a culture that exists there. 2300 years ago, there's reference to them for the first time, but we don't know much about them. The first information that we get is this Sangam poetry. Now, of course, in Kaladi, in Tamil Nadu, we have some excavations, but we have pottery, we have instruments, we have bricks, but really not much information still again about political conditions. But we do get a sense of the people who lived at that time. And we get to know that they loved music, they loved to sing, they loved to dance, they were involved in basic agriculture because they talk of rice, they talk of maize, they were hunters, gatherers, they talk of flowers, fruits, different kinds of meat that they consumed. So social conditions. We know that they were familiar with Brahmins, they were familiar with Ramayana. There's a reference to the Ramayana especially the episode of monkeys finding Sita's jewelry. There's reference to the Mahabharata of a king from South India feeding the Pandavas and the Kauravas during the battle. So there is some references to North Indians. They refer to them as Aryas. There's references to Brahmins, Buddhists, Jains, but they seem to be a relatively secular society. There's description of landscape, and gods are linked to landscape. So on top of the mountain there is Seyo. In the forest there is Perumal. In the pasture land there is Perumal. In the forests there is Mayo. Then in the fields there is Indra. In the ocean there is Varuna. In the wilderness there is Kotravai, or the wild goddess. So 5 landscapes are described: mountains, forests and pasture lands, fields, ocean or seashores, and dry barren land, each associated with different gods and goddesses. It's the first time that landscape is evoking emotions, and you find this emotionality in this poetry. That's why we are talking about, it talks about social conditions. We know they're talking about war. They are talking about drummers and musicians who praise their chieftains. In exchange they get rewards. They're talking about traveling through South Indian lands. So we have a social sense. We know that women, we have different kinds of women in the Tamil epics. Women who are faithful to a husband, so the Pattini. We have the nuns, the Buddhist nuns, the Jain nuns who choose not to marry. There's reference to courtesans, women who were entertainers, dancers, singers, and had many lovers, like Madhavi and her daughter Mani Meghalai, and the grandmother who wants the granddaughter to follow the family profession, the granddaughter Mani Meghalai who wants to be a nun. We have conflicts between Jain nuns and Buddhist nuns. So we have these poetries. There's love, eroticism, monasticism, violent confrontations and battles, and demands for generosity. So we get a sense of the economic and social conditions. We do not get much information about the political conditions, about who are the kings, how did they do the territory. We know that there were wars, and one very interesting feature is during the war, kings would claim the totems of the rival kings. The totems are usually plants. So plants like the Kadamba tree was for the Kadamba dynasty. So there is some kind of a reference with plants. We have reference to the early kinds of settlements, small settlements, agrarian economy emerging, herding economy emerging. So these are the social and economic conditions that we come up in the Sangam literature.
So I think students will understand, as Devdutt also mentioned, that it's not always about political history, which you would get to know from these literary texts like Sangam literature, but how society, the economical aspects, how these things are also relevant, not forgetting the cultural elements which these literature tell us about. The other point is that please note such kind of questions demand examples. Okay, so you have to support your arguments with relevant evidences and examples from history and from culture. So that is a point which should be noted. Now let's move on to the second question, and Devdutt, if you allow me to ask you about Jain and Buddhist literatures. So what are they, or how are they relevant from the perspective of culture?
So why is Jain and Buddhist literature important to understand Indian culture? Now, the oldest Indian literature that we have is the Vedic literature, and here you have people worshipping ancestors and gods who located in celestial regions, offering them praise, offering them the soma juice in exchange, expecting good luck, fortune, children, success in battle, wives, all material things. And then suddenly you have, about 2,500 years ago, new wave of thinking which is more monastic, and it appears in the Bihar region, and this manifests in ideas that are first transmitted orally and then finally written down. This is the Jain and the Buddhist literature coming from the Magad regions. The language is not Sanskrit. Now it is Magadhi, Ardha Magadhi, together called Prakrit. Magadhi is more popularly known as Pali. It's a very formal Buddhist language that is later put down in writing in Sri Lanka by Buddha Ghosha in 500 CE, so much later. But the transmission takes place and is orally transmitted. The Jain stories are transmitted. They're transmitted to different parts of India. So we have a new, so why is it significant? One, it's a new idea. It's about monastic ideals. It's talking a lot about karma, liberation, moving away from the householder's life. So the content is different. The language is different. So it's Magadhi, Ardha Magadhi. The geography is also different. While the Vedic landscape is more Gangetic, the Jain and the Buddhist landscape moves from Bihar and moves southwards towards Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. So south starts getting important. So this is another reason it's important. It manifests later into Tamil literature. So you have Tamil literature, Kannada literature, and even Sanskrit literature. So later Jain and Buddhist literature shows regional languages emerging. There is Tamil, there is Kannada, and Sanskrit becomes important. So these are the reasons why Jainism and Buddhism are important contributors to Indian culture, to understand Indian culture.
So Devdutt, I'm also reminded of your last episode where you have mentioned a little bit about Buddhist and Jain literature. So students should also go and watch that episode if you haven't watched yet. Also remember that how geography is playing such an important role as the religion is moving from one state to another. The impact is seen on literature also. So that is another important thing, because sometimes the questions are asked and how geography impacts culture and so on. Now, let's move on to the next question. And my next question is related to the Persian literature. So, Devdutt, if you can tell us that how Persian literature contributed to Indian culture.
So Persian literature comes into India from 1,000 years ago, when the Central Asian Turks start entering India, and they carry with them the Persian culture and a religion that started in Arabia. So you must look at the map and be clear where is, if you go westwards from India, you will first come to the Hindu Kush mountains. You cross it, you see the Afghanistan, then you see Iran, which is Persia, and to the south of Persia, as you travel, you see the Arab lands. Now, India was connected with the Arab lands through trade, especially southern India. Northern India, through Persia, you have this culture coming into India through the warlords from Central Asia. So that's how you should understand that a little bit. And they bring the Farsi culture or the Persian literature. Now, court language is very important. Oldest court language that we have is Prakrit. Ashoka uses a form of Magadhi language. Later, this Prakrit language shifts towards Sanskrit. So you have Rudradaman, the Shaka king from Gujarat, Rajasthan side, near Girnar, writing in Sanskrit Prashastis. His declarations are in Sanskrit. So Prakrit becomes Sanskrit. Then Sanskrit cosmopolis emerges. All the kings start using Sanskrit from 300 CE to 1300 CE, from Afghanistan to Vietnam. This becomes a very important language. Then you have the slow rise of regional literature like Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, and that's when the Persian literature comes to North India in Delhi. It parks itself in Delhi, and that's when Persian literature emerges, and these people are writing stories, tarikhs or histories of their kings. Of course, their hagiographies. Hagiography is different from a biography. Biography tends to be more realistic and rational, while hagiography is exaggerated, and they will write things very dramatically. So, for example, we know that the Afghan and the Turkish king came to India for material reasons. They came to raid the wealth of India. But in the hagiographies, they will keep telling how these kings came to India to spread Islam. It was a religious motivation. These were holy Ghazis fighting for the cause. So this is the PR department at work. So when the PR department works, you have the hagiographies. So the Persian literature comes into India. It influences the local languages. So while the court language is Persian, the local language, people start talking in Hindavi, which mingles with Farsi, and a new language of the Barak emerges, this soldiers emerges called Urdu, or the language of the barrack, or language of the store, of the street, of the soldiers, and this gives rise to a new form of literature called Urdu. Urdu literature emerges, Hindi literature emerges, Hindavi emerges. We have these languages emerging. If you look at languages in Gujarat, you look at languages in Maharashtra, you see this slight influence of Persian languages emerging. The suffix G starts to appear at this time. You have Shahaji, Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji. So this G suffix starts to appear. Even today we say Ji ha. Where did this word G come from? Because it emerges only after the Persians came to India. It probably has roots in Uzbekistan. That's one of the, nobody is 100% sure where it comes from. But ask yourself, where did this word G come from? It's not there in Sanskrit. So suddenly you see this influence coming in. The Parsi, not Parsi, but Parsi word we use for different reasons. We use for the Zoroastrians who migrated to India and carry the Zoroastrian traditions. But Farsi language comes, Urdu emerges. Urdu is a mixture of Indian languages and Persian languages. During 1857, when Mirza Ghalib is writing Urdu, he uses a lot of Persian words, so it almost feels that it's a Persian language. But really, the older Urdu language has more Indian words. During the partition of India, of course, Urdu started being associated with Islam, and Hindi started being associated with Hinduism, and it played a very complicated political role. But Persian literature contributes to India because brings new ways of presenting ideas. History writing becomes important, court chronicles become important, legal documents become important. So you have the rise of legal documentation being written. Later they're written by the Marathas in the Modi script. You have legal documentation, Rajput courts being written. So legal documentation becomes important. And of course, literature. New forms of literature emerges, romance poetry emerges. You have poetries like Padmavat happening, romance literature based like Laila Majnu, and you have in Sindh, you have the stories of love, poetries emerging around this time, passionate love poetries of unrequited love emerging. Ghazals emerging, new forms of poetry. So when we're talking about literature, we should talk about religious literature, secular literature, romantic literature, legal and political literature. So when you classify it, you will get an understanding of how to write the answer. And that's important because it shows your mind is very organized. As I said, with Parsi literature, you have court literature, you have court literature describing the life of the king, you have legal documents that starts being put down, then you have these monuments where the king's declarations, farmans start emerging at this time. And of course, you have storytelling translations like Tuti Nama, which is a translation of Shukha Saptati, Sanskrit literature is translated. Razam Nama, the book of war, which is Mahabharata and Ramayana being translated by the court poets of the Akbar's time. We have the rise of Sufi poetry emerging along with Bhakti poetry. You have epics being written in the local languages. So you find these form of literature emerging.
Well, that's very beautifully summarized at how Persian language or Persian literature brought change in the cultural landscape. I'm also, interested in telling students that when, Devdutt says that, look at the map and keep the map open, it's very important when you're studying such topics where geography is also involved. It's important to have your atlas or the world map or India map in front of you. It helps in two ways. It helps you to prepare for the topic which you're doing in current, but also help you in consolidating over your geography part. So that is one thing. Also, when you're talking about Urdu as a language, we've covered it in the previous episode when we're talking about language and culture. So do revise, do revisit those episodes. If you have any doubt, there is another important thing which I felt that I should mention, that there are many things while Devdutt is talking about, we all know somewhere in our minds or somewhere we've read or somewhere we've listened to, but it's very important to get them organized, okay? And that's why these kind of series will help. Get them organized at one place, okay, for not only for your answer in mains, but also for, whenever you're going for an interview and everything, It's important to have these things which you know organized at one place, and that is important. Now let's move on to the next question. The next question is about travelogues. So Devdutt, can you tell us or help us that how travelogues are important source or important sources to understand culture?
Travelogues. Travelogues are people who travel to India, they visit India and they write about it. And therefore, through their writings, we understand India. Now, the funny thing about Indians is that we really didn't write our own histories a lot. We wrote poetry and we talked of Ramayana and Mahabharata far more than writing about the lives of kings or geography or a history. Few books like there is the Rajatarangini, which tells you the history of Kashmir, or you have Skanda Puran, which tells you the mythological stories associated with various geographies in India, or you have Shankara Digvijaya, written in the 14th century, which tells you about Shankaracharya, who lived 5 centuries earlier, and how he traveled across India. And they are really more fantastic hagiographies, exaggerated stories. We do not get a accurate portrayal of India's social conditions. The only place where we get it is a Tamil poetry, which is the Sangam poetry, has some understanding of what social life was in the Tamil land. And there are poetries. There is a travelogue there about these professional drummers traveling in the Chola countryside. They're traveling to places and they're talking about the food. So you do have some travel writing in Tamil literature, but main travel writing comes from those who came to India. Now, who came to India? First it was the Greeks, then it was the Chinese, then it was the Arabs and the Persians, and finally the Europeans. And therefore you have travelogues of the Greeks. So you have Megasthenes' famous Indica when he visited the court of Chandragupta Maurya. We don't have the original, but we have people writing about it. Herodotus writes something about India based on what he hears from people. He doesn't travel to India. Megasthenes travels to India and writes about it. So we have that information. We have during Roman times, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. He is a merchant who writes about the trade which is happening through the monsoon trade which is happening along the coasts of India. So we have that information. Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, he talks about Sopara and the coasts and the ports of India. So we have that information and what is being imported and exported, Indian cotton, pearls. We have with the Chinese, we have roughly the period of Harshavardhan, the 7th century, when Islam is rising in the world. You have when Harshavardhan is king in India, in Thaneshwar. Just before him, you have some Chinese writers. After him, there are Chinese writers. So you get this period between the 5th, post-Gupta period. You have writings of Chinese travelers who are entering India. They're going to Nalanda, which is in Bihar. How are they coming? They're coming, some of them are coming by the eastern route. Some of them are coming via Central Asia, some of them are coming via ship. And so you have the Chinese writers writing about conditions in India. That's very important. And then you have the Arab writers like Al-Biruni, Ibn Battuta, who travel to India in the Islamic period and write from a very Islamic perspective of how they see India. Al-Biruni tells about the conditions just before the entry of Delhi Sultanate. Ibn Battuta lives with the Delhi Sultans in the Tughlaq period, and he writes about that. Then you have the Europeans coming to India. Remember, horse trade was very big, and therefore trading of horses was very big. And this is what brings a lot. And spice trade was big, and cotton trade was big. Luxury goods from India traveled to Europe, and therefore you have the Europeans coming by the sea route. So you have Italians writing, you have the French writing, you have the British writing, the Dutch writing. You have different writers. The details, of course, you can get in the books. So please check the book for all the technical details. But I wanted to think systematically and how these writings help us figure out the Indian culture. So they come to India and they write about India in their own languages, and we get to understand India better. Of course, there is bias in their writings, a lot of bias, but you get a sense of what is happening in India.
So just like literature is a vast topic, similarly, a topic like travelogue, the subtopic, is also very vast because it goes across time. So then what is important? The important part here is to understand such standalone topics in a more systematic manner. Go with timeline, take up important travelogues, understand their relevance, know a few examples here and there. And that's how this topic should be covered. Of course, for prelims, you should know important factual, factual aspects of travelogues as well. But I think students would have got a broader view about these subtopics, which are a part of literature and culture. Before going ahead, let's take Devdutt's important point to ponder.
So I want you to think about the two great epics of India, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Why are they so important to Indian culture? Why is it so important? And you'll find a lot to do with literature and its transmission across India. So we'll discuss that in a future episode.
So that's all for today. But the topic of literature and culture is a vast topic. So there are going to be more subtopics coming up in the next few episodes. So stay tuned and keep watching UPSC Essentials of the Indian Express. Join us for live at 8 p.m. on Instagram and YouTube, where you ask and I answer. So subscribe for the Indian Express YouTube channel and stay updated with such important videos. Bye bye. Manas Srivastava signing off.